under the operating budget, school-based budgeting, and weighted student funding formula. Dr. Register.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board. I'm going to just make a very brief remark and then ask Chris Henson to come up to start a presentation on student-based budgeting. And Chris will introduce, Chris, come on up if you will. Chris will introduce other people who will be taking part in the presentation this afternoon. And the only thing I want to do is emphasize the fact that this is work that's been ongoing really for the better part of 2 years now, in looking at a way to more equitably transfer funds to schools, to fund schools, to fund the budget. And it is an equitable approach, and it's also one that gives a great deal more autonomy to principals and the school faculties in determining how they use their budget. We've been looking forward to this presentation for some time, and I'm going to turn it over to Chris now. And I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions, and I think we'll take the better part of the hour overall to do the presentation and to answer questions that you might have. Chris?
Thank you, Dr. Register, and I would like to introduce a couple of folks. First, Jonathan Travers here is a partner with Education Resource Strategies, or ERS. They're out of the Boston area. And then Derek Ritchie out of our Office of Innovation. Derek's been doing a lot of work, a lot of the technical work as it relates to student-based budgeting. They're both going to be a part of this presentation. What we're going to be talking about during this part of the work session, first we're going to describe what is student-based budgeting. Jonathan Travers will be discussing that, also discussing the local and national context. We will also describe our design. Derek will participate in that and how it impacts our schools. We'll identify success factors and measures of success. And we'll also share the perspective of a couple of our principals that are here who have already gone through the flexibility part of this process. And one of those actually did sit on our design team. So we'll invite them up to provide some perspective. The first thing I wanted to do is to talk a little bit more about our partnership with ERS. We didn't go this alone. We set out to seek some expertise in this area, and ERS has worked with school districts across the country who have transitioned to school-based budgeting and then to what we call student-based budgeting. One thing that I was adamant about was that I didn't want to repeat others' mistakes, and so if we've got school districts who've already gone down this road and have made some, have landed in some potholes, etc., I didn't want to do that. And also didn't want to recreate the wheel. If we've got some districts in the country that are doing this and doing it well, let's emulate what they're doing. And so ERS has been a big help in that regard. And again, we've been working with them for a number of months. So I'm going to turn it over now to Jonathan and let him go through what is student-based budgeting from a local and national context.
Thank you, Chris. Good evening. I want to start with just sort of a definition, what is student-based budgeting, and then we'll talk a little bit more sort of strategically, how do we think about how SBB, student-based budgeting, should fit into an overall district strategy or district theory of action. So first, just the technical definition. So student-based budgeting, SBB, is a way of allocating dollars to schools instead of staff. Those dollars are allocated to schools on the basis of the students that are being served in those schools and the characteristics of those students. So how is that different from what we typically, how is SBB different from what we typically see? So schools receive funding in a traditional system based on staffing ratios. So every teacher is allocated per 22 students. A guidance counselor can come in every 350 students and so on. So we get district-wide staffing ratios that drive resources and staffing out to all schools. That's sort of the traditional system. SBB shifts that allocation to a formula that provides a base per pupil amount and then is supplemented by extra dollars for students that have different characteristics, that have different needs. Derek will talk a little bit more about what those characteristics are. The school budgets in a sort of a traditional system, yes, they'll include specific positions, but they're typically just going to, when we often ask folks, so in traditional systems, principals, so what's your budget? They'll say, well, it's about $7,000 because I can buy some instructional materials and paper and so for that $7,000. Actually, the budget for the school is in the millions of dollars, but they think of their budget as being this very small amount because they don't really have flexibility or control over those resources. So typically in an SBB kind of framework, we shift from the budget that principals think of as being theirs to control, being in the 1-2% range of the total school budget to be sort of 40 to 80% of the dollars that actually play out in schools. So it's a big shift. So how does this approach, how does SBB fit into a strategy that ultimately is going to drive increased student achievement? Because that's the thing that we're all here for. I would say as just a premise, it is not a strategy in and upon itself to drive student achievement. It is part of a strategy. And so that's what this next slide goes into. We think of SBB as a core to an aligned academic improvement strategy. So for SBB to really work here, you've got to have these other components go along with it. So first, you've got to have a vision for the principal's role to be about empowerment and flexibility. You want the principal, the one that is sort of closest to the action in the school, making the decisions about what to do with the resources that are being allocated to that school. And you've got to have some confidence that principals are going to make those decisions effectively. And so we'll see, Derek will speak to it a little bit. It's really important to have an effective support strategy for principals to be able to make good choices with the flexibility they've got. Second, often you need to think about SBB in the context of an overall accountability system for schools. So if you are mandating inputs across schools, we want all schools to have the same exact class sizes, to have the same exact course offerings, to have the same exact master schedule, to have to look exactly the same, and we're going to mandate all of those inputs. That does not fit with the idea of having principals have flexibility on all that. So you have to have coherence between how you think about school accountability, be focused on outcomes, and the flexibility and control you want to give to your school leaders. The last part of this comes to how central office approaches its role. And we go back on this point to what Henry Ford said about the Model T. You can have any color you want as long as it's black. We need our folks in central office to actually think of what their job is to support schools organizing the resources in the ways that make the most sense for that school specifically, as opposed to drive the same thing, as opposed to painting every school black. Last couple of points here on when SBB works well, when it fits into a broader district strategy. The funding levels that you give to schools have to provide meaningful flexibility. We've seen it in a number of instances where the funding levels are so low across all schools that after you satisfy collective bargaining agreement restrictions, after you satisfy state mandates, there really isn't meaningful flexibility for principals to have. So you need to have funding at a certain point to actually have principals have what we call authentic flexibility. And then the last point here is that if you've got a heterogeneous mix of schools, it's more likely that the designs that you want to be in your schools are going to be different across the whole portfolio of schools. We've worked recently with Aldine, Texas, not on SBB and other issues. Their schools are almost all sized exactly the same, have very similar student populations. They have a very centralized theory of action, and so it wouldn't make sense for a place like Aldine, which is achieving good things, but it wouldn't make sense for them to go down this path of trying to build out student-based budgets and try to give school leaders that flexibility. As Chris said, we've supported districts across the country in doing this kind of work. We've got a number of districts up on the right there that are implementing SBB. I think of that list, we've worked with about half, maybe a little bit more than half of those districts. And as we have gone through the work with Derek and the team this year, we've, as Chris has said, we've tried to say, well, what are the effective practices that we've seen across these districts? What are the ineffective practices that we've seen, and how can we help advise the team here to focus on the former and avoid the latter?
You know, we've been asked, why are we doing this? Why are we going to this type of funding model for our schools? And it all begins with our strategic plan, our Education 2018 Excellence for Every Student. If you look at the personalized learning lever there at the bottom left, you've got two little boxes under the theory of system change. The first is transformational leadership. You can see from the box on the screen on the left there, school leaders require the ability to make decisions with respect to staffing and budgeting. And then also equity and excellence is another of those little boxes there on the personalized learning lever, where the school district needs to direct resources and supports to the specific needs of learners, transitioning to student-based budgeting where funding is directly tied to students and their individual needs. And so if you look there in the middle, the ability to personalize requires an equitable resource allocation and meaningful principal flexibility. So that's the reason why we are pursuing this route, is it's tied directly to what we've said through our strategic plan that would make our schools and our students more successful. Our approach has three overarching goals, and we talk about these a lot. The first is equity, to improve equity. Funding is based on the differentiated needs of students, and students are funded equitably regardless of which schools they attend. Number two, we want to increase transparency. Visibility regarding school allocations, how they're calculated, how much schools receive as far as their funding allocation. Also visibility as it relates to principal choices and the resulting achievement, the achievement results. And then thirdly, to expand flexibility. As we've said, school leaders need to have the flexibility and the accountability that goes along with it to design their schools to best meet student needs. And so we've honed in and concentrated on equity, transparency, and flexibility. Those are the three overarching goals of moving towards student-based budgeting. There are two central components to it. The first, the school level flexibility, where we have already been experiencing that for a number of our schools, which you'll see in just a moment, where principals are and have been empowered to make individual school design and resource choices. And then the second part of that would be need-based allocations, which is that transition over to student-based budgeting, where resources are allocated to schools according to the unique needs of students. And then what's very important at the bottom is our goal, and I'm sincere about this, our goal is to give principals and school leadership teams control over as many resources as possible. What we want them to do is to question anything that they don't have control over. Why don't I have control over that one thing? What we're going to do when we provide them with the calculation in their funding tool, their budget tool, is to show them not only how the amount of money that they're receiving is calculated, but also what's excluded, what's not included. It'll be things like transportation and utilities and maintenance and substitutes and different things like that. What we are hoping, what I'm planning on, is that we'll have some principals who will have some healthy questioning, some healthy tension as it relates to, you know, I'd like to have a little piece of that thing that's not included in my budget, and so we can have that discussion. Does that make sense to provide that in the allocation to schools, or does it make sense to keep that at the district level and provide it as a central service? And so again, our goal is over time to push out to schools as many resources as possible. We have been implementing a phased-in approach to where we are today. We began back last year in 2013-14 with what we call here school-level flexibility, or what we've been calling school-based budgeting, where we originally had 17 schools. It ended up being 15. Those were the schools that were headed up by network lead principals and it also included all of our innovation zone, I-zone schools. The reason that it went from 17 to 15 was that we had a couple of principals leave, and so we didn't think that it made sense for the 2 new principals to just jump in. But we did have 15 schools go throughout the year last year with school-based budgeting. It represented over $62 million that went out to schools, representing over 10,000 students in that process. And then this year we expanded it. We expanded it to 55 schools. So we currently have all of our middle schools, all of our high schools, plus 6 elementary schools that are headed up by network lead principals. They represent over $222 million, over 42,000 students, where they have been through the process of school-level flexibility or school-based budgeting. And then we will transition to student-based budgeting next year with all of our schools. This will provide both the school-level flexibility as well as the needs-based allocation through the SBB process. It'll be 139 schools. It'll be over $400 million and represent 78,000 students. And so this has been a phased-in approach where we, again, have been partnering and working with ERS because it's a big chunk to take on in one time in a district our size, and we wanted to make sure that we weren't biting off more than we could chew, and also that learn from any tweaks that need to be made along the way. So I'll turn it over to Derek now to talk about our specific design.
Thanks, Chris. As Chris said, I'm going to lead us through kind of the taking all of this context and the why. I'm going to walk you through kind of what are the design choices we've made for next fiscal year in terms of how schools will be funded. I'm going to start with just mentioning that we've been at this for a while. I mean, Chris mentioned that since SY 13-14, since this time about 2 years ago, we've been working with schools on individual school level flexibility, and that work has continued through. Last summer, we started the design process around what would our actually needs-based formula look like. And so we engaged a design team that worked for about 3 months that included principals, teachers, and central office staff. And we talked about things like what should be included in the pool, what should be excluded from the pool, and then what are the types of student characteristics we should weight, and then other considerations. That work then resulted in a set of recommendations that we then vetted through principal focus groups, teacher focus groups. We had a parent focus group, and then a number of kind of central office department level meetings where we vetted and iterated on these designs. And we did that most of the bulk of last calendar year, and that has resulted in what our design is now. And so just real quick at a level set about the equity definition that the design team came up with. Schools are funded according to their needs, and what that means in practice is schools with similar needs are funded at similar per pupil levels, and schools with dissimilar needs are funded at dissimilar per pupil levels. Kind of how that looks kind of visually is as the level of need in a school increases, so too should the per pupil allocation to that school. And we control several factors of this chart. We control the rise and run of the line, so it could be flatter if we weighted the needs less than others. So we have a lot of control over how we define need and what the rise and run of the line is. But essentially, this is the type of thing we're trying to create. So let me show you what ours looks like right now. So this is a scatter plot of last year's expenditures across our schools. Each school's a dot, or whatever that is, a triangle. On the bottom is a percent proficient in advanced score, so I just use that as a proxy for need. It's not the only measure of need, but we just used it as a proxy for this calculation. And I want to just highlight 3 groups here, 3 groups of schools. This group at the top right are obviously fairly highly funded relative to their peers and lowish performing. This group at the bottom left, high performing, low funded. And then you've got this group at the bottom right that represents a big bulk of schools that are actually low funded and lower performing. And in our view, working through this design process, it was that group of schools that really needed some equity gains. They are similarly needy to the circle above them, but receive a decent amount less per pupil. And so we really wanted to focus on that group as a place where we wanted to make up some equity ground. Now, I say this is our general equity strategy because there are SBB implementations where you would fund equity gains at those schools by taking from others. And we've generally moved with an approach of not wanting to do that. And so what we said is we want to fund equity gains at those schools with no kind of per pupil losses at those other schools. And so we'll talk a little bit more about the mechanics of that. But that's kind of our general strategies. We need to push this group up a little bit without necessarily taking from those other ones. Sure, and to head off a likely question, like who are these schools at the top? These are, most of them are enhanced option elementary schools. They have a longer day, they have lower class sizes, so that drives up the per pupil expenditure of those schools. It's also schools who receive resources through the student assignment plan. And then there is, I believe there are two other outliers that are like Brick Church and Cameron, mostly because they are so small that for the 1 year they had left, they end up being a fairly high funded school. So the design team came up with 5 goals that they wanted to make sure the recommendations were aligned to. First is to make sure we fund student characteristics, not school types, which is, of course, the guiding principles we've been talking about. We also wanted to increase our investment in English language learners. A lot of those schools that were in that bottom right portion, a lot of those tended to be medium to high English language learner schools, or schools with English language learner populations. As we looked at the data, obviously EL status is highly correlated and predictive of level of proficiency. We also wanted to invest directly in lower performing students with a focus on earlier grades. And of course, prior performance is the best indicator of future performance. So we wanted to make sure that we had a stake in that. Fourth design goal was to increase the equity and transparency of special ed allocations. And then finally, to ensure the viability of lower need and deliberately small schools. In these types of formulas, those schools that have less need and tend to be small by choice or by design often suffer through the formulas. We wanted to make sure to not let that happen if it was a choice that we were making for that school to function. So these are our weights. This is the design that we've put in place and are implementing now. In fact, schools are slated to receive their budgets on Thursday. And they will be based on, they will have a base weight. This is kind of the 1.0 is approximately $4,250 per pupil. And I'll go through the next slide shows kind of how it all builds upon each other. And then we have a grade level weight, largely to account for differences in class size requirements at different levels. We also, in the spirit of funding prior academic performance, or lower performing students, we have a weight for prior academic performance in the middle school and the high school. And in the elementary, we're actually using sort of poverty as a proxy for prior performance because we don't have a kindergarten readiness assessment or any valid source of data to look at there. We also have a weight for English language learners, and then a number of different weights for special education based on the hours of service requirement for those students. So you'll notice that. So all weights are based on individual student characteristics. And then we do also have kind of a baseline services or hold harmless component to provide a safety net for the schools that I mentioned. So how does this work in practice? So 2 students, Mark and Maria, both start off with a base weight of $4,250, as I showed you on the last slide. And then they get additional weights on top of that. So Mark is an economically disadvantaged student, so he gets another 0.1 weight on top of that. He also has an IEP and is identified as a SPED option 2 student. And so Mark's total funding level is about a 1.6 or $6,800. So if you had 100 Marks in your school, 100 kids that look like Mark in your school, you'd get 100 times this amount. Maria is a non-proficient student and an English language learner, and so therefore her weights look a little different. And so if you had 100 Marias, this is what you get. If you had 100 of each, you would add them up together. It's kind of how the mechanics of it work. And just identify sort of to what extent did we achieve our goals. I just want to highlight 2 of those. So when our proposal is fully funded, schools with medium to high EL populations could experience dollar per pupil gains of 4 to 8%, which could mean a couple of extra teachers in those schools. Also, again, when fully funded, schools with average to above average needs, again, whether that means they're high poverty or low proficiency, could receive 5 to 6% increases. And then I'll also highlight that high EL schools who are also high needs, meaning they're either high EL and high free and reduced lunch, or high EL and low proficiency, could see 8 to 11% increases in per pupil funding, which could be a pretty significant increase in those schools and could enable some very interesting designs about serving those types of students. And finally, I'll land with my section with talking about principal training, because this is a really important component. Is don't just give a principal a budget and say, go forth. So we've done a lot of work over the last 3 years in getting principals prepared. In the first year, when there was only 15 schools, we could do a lot of one-to-one hands-on work. As we've scaled out, we've systematized it a little bit more. So just focusing on what we've done this year. Dr. Steele has been very supportive of making this a monthly part of the professional learning that principals receive at the tier-based component of principals meetings. It's been a topic nearly every month since the fall about how principals can identify priorities, how they can identify needs, translate those into priorities, translate those into strategies, and then ultimately figure out how to translate those strategies into design choices that manifest themselves in budgets and staffing plans and master schedules, which is where they're at now. We also have 10 schools throughout our district that are engaged in 2 different strategic school design cohorts, meaning they've spent almost the bulk of the year working with a third-party provider, 4 of which are working with ERS to do really deep school-based, with a design team at the school, needs assessment all the way through design choice. So a very intense development strategy at 10 schools this year, and we did several schools last year as well. We've also, over the last 2 weeks, been providing pretty intense training to principals on the technical aspects of how to make their budget choices and make everything align. So we've been out working on a cluster-by-cluster basis over the last 2 weeks when the ice allowed us to do that. And then we've also had a multitude of meetings in this room with central office departments to talk about how does this look from our perspective? How do we want to review budgets? What are the things schools have to do? What are the things they have flexibility over? And really just making sure we were all aligned as a central office function around what guidance we were giving schools and making sure that guidance was as consistent, predictable, and transparent as possible. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Jonathan. He's going to identify some critical success factors, and then we'll end with a couple of principal testimonials.
Okay, so we've talked about what is SPB, why do districts do it. We've talked about in some good detail how this is rolling out here in Nashville, the process that we went through to develop it, and sort of the structure of the weights themselves. So my last job here is to say, looking across the country, when this works well, what happened? When this doesn't work well, what didn't happen? So I want to leave you with these 5 takeaways that we think of as sort of implementation critical success factors, and how you as a board and sort of leadership here can think about making sure that we are in fact on track against them. So the first is about being provided with what we think of as, again, sufficient authentic flexibility. Districts sometimes go about this by saying, you know what, we're going to unlock some dollars. We're going to give folks a little bit of flexibility. We're going to control over 10% of their dollars. Then next year we'll make it 15%, and then we'll build it up and build it up as we go. You're not going to get meaningfully different school designs if you're giving folks this much flexibility. There is a critical mass of flexibility that we think school leaders have to have control over for this to actually, pick up and have the effect that we want. Our sense at ERS is that it's about 70% of school-based, and for year 1, we want to be as close as we can to 70% of school-based resources. So this is not total district dollars, but these are dollars that play out in schools. About 70%, we were saying upstairs that we think we're a little bit above that, but I think we'll know exactly when the ink dries and the allocations on Thursday. Second, that we can't just expect that principals know how to do this. So we've got to be able to provide meaningful support in how to utilize this flexibility. I think the mistake that folks often make here is they get overwhelmed by the technical and they forget the strategic. So yes, we've got to make sure folks know how to read their allocations. We've got to make sure that they know how to fill out the forms and know that their budgets are balanced. More important, frankly, we've got to make sure that they know how to solve the needs of their school communities and think through how do they organize their time, money, and people, their resources differently. You talked about having central office folks engaged in this room. There is commonly a little bit of like buyer's remorse or retrenchment that happens once these flexibilities have shifted control from central to schools. And so we say, oh gosh, I was happy to give folks flexibility on that. I was just hoping that they wouldn't use it. So we've got to be, this is the reality of adaptive change. So we've got to be thoughtful and keep our eye on making sure that folks centrally are being very thoughtful and following through on the flexibilities that they've offered through this process. One way to do that is to ground all of the communication as we did today and with all stakeholders, principals, central office folks, in the why. How does what we are implementing here connect to a strategy to improve academic performance? We think that by sort of consistently hitting that message, it helps folks connect the individual micro decisions that they are influencing and making to the broader district improvement strategy. And the last point here, I don't mean to pick on the enrollment projection folks. The takeaway here is that details really matter on this kind of change. Enrollment projections, getting those enrollment projections as close to right as we can is really important. If these allocations that you'll be releasing on Thursday are predicated on a certain number of kids with certain characteristics showing up in schools in August and September, if we're way off, we're going to understaff, we're going to under-resource some schools and over-resource some other schools. And as I'm sure you all know, it is really disruptive to try to move resources around schools once the school year is started. So this is getting the enrollment projections right is is an example of a little detail that we've really got to be thoughtful about as we roll this out. I want to close just by coming back to what success looks like here. At the end of the day, ERS views this as part of an academic improvement strategy. To head off one question, we don't have regression or a causal analysis to show that districts that implemented SBB in this way achieved this much academic performance. The science on that is just not going to happen, just science-wise. The thing that we've got to be thoughtful about as district leaders is saying, well, what exactly is it that we want SBB to accomplish for us? And can we measure those things to make sure that those things are happening? Can we quantify our flexibility, as we've got in these first two metrics up here? Can we quantify principal satisfaction with the support that they're getting? Can we quantify out some of the changes that schools are making in their designs? Not just their dollars, not just we were being allocated of these kinds of things, and we are now choosing to purchase these kinds of things. But there's broader changes than that. Are we evolving our master schedule? Are we differentiating, personalizing resources to kids based on their individual needs more deliberately than we were previously? And ultimately, so I'll leave it at that ultimately we want to get to a place where we're thinking critically about what it is that SBB is to achieve for us, and let's focus on measuring that, and hopefully then that can connect to a broader strategy for improving district performance.
And I will ask Schuler and Damon if you wouldn't mind coming on up. I did want to just close with a couple of things. One is, for the last couple of years, what we have done is we have changed from a staffing allocation where the district tells schools, based upon your number of students, these are the number of positions you receive, and these are the types of positions you receive. We have changed that completely to say, okay, next year, based upon the needs of your students, this is the pool of money that you have. And then you go and design it based upon the goals and objectives that are set out in your school improvement plan. Because we know all schools are different. And so it is a change in what the expectations are for principals. And it also is a change on what the expectations are as we hire new principals. Because this is something that, as I said, we're going to be going district-wide with next year. And the reason is to provide a more equitable distribution of resources to our schools. And so Schuler, as I mentioned, Schuler was on our design team, which established the different weights. And obviously, as a high school principal, he's been involved with school-based budgeting this year. And then Damon Cathy, as a middle school principal, also has been involved with school-based budgeting and also with the instructional design process. So Schuler, I'll let you start, and Damon, if you'll finish up, I appreciate it.
Thank you. Good evening, and appreciate the opportunity to come here and share with you. I didn't have a lot prepared. I wanted to just make a few remarks and then be able to answer any questions that you might have. I think the first thing I'd like to address is the process that we went through this past summer to help develop this particular rollout. I think most people at some point in time in their career have been on a committee where you felt like you were there to rubber stamp something someone else already decided. That was not the case here. When we came in, the agenda was to empower principals and to fund more equitably. And everything was on the table, and it went from there. And Derek did a wonderful job of facilitating that. And so we had some healthy discussion around what should be in the formula, what should not be in the formula, et cetera. And it was a good process to go through. And I think what we came up with was something that is a great start point for us. I hope that as we move forward in the future, we can continue to mature and grow this model, because there are some things that we decided at the beginning probably should not be in this model. But I do believe that in future years, as we get more comfortable and more adept at using this model, are probably fair game to put in there. And so I think that's something I hope we can continue to grow with in the future. Just this first year, being able to have some budget flexibility has done wonders for our school. The ability to sit down with our leadership team, look at our data, make some decisions about perhaps this is a resource that we've always had that we're not really getting a lot of bang for a buck out of this, that maybe we want to pull that one back and put in a different resource that we need a little bit more. That ability to look at our school data and make those decisions based on what our school's needs are has been critical, because what we need at our school may be very different than what Damon needs at his school or someone else needs at their school. And so again, it goes this idea of individualized learning, which I think is very important. But most importantly, I think is pushing these decisions down to the point of impact as close as possible. That if you want to truly empower people, push those abilities to make those decisions down to the closest point of impact as you can. People own those decisions a whole lot more, and that's what we're finding in our building. It's made a big difference with that. Beyond that, I think I'd just like to see if anybody has any questions. We can kind of go from there. Damon?
And they can just address questions to all of us.
Good evening. And so I'll just continue where Schuler left off. The budget flexibility that we were allowed to participate in this year really has challenged our faculty in terms of making decisions that are really student-centered and looking at our context and what we need to do for our particular students. It was an exciting process, even the first year before ERS was on our side and working with us. But again, it was also a process that required us to be very thoughtful. Some of the decisions that we made were disruptive and difficult, but you know that when you're doing the right thing for students, oftentimes that is the case. But in the end, we do believe that the data will indicate that we've made some good decisions. And one example, we actually traded in 2 positions for an extra exceptional education teacher. That was a really tough decision, because we had to realize, or we realized that, you know, behind these decisions there are people. They're not numbers, they're people. And what are we going to do if we're trading in positions for an exceptional education position? We had some very honest conversations with those individuals, and what we found was their thinking very much aligned with ours. that they needed a different level of support, or saw that our students needed a different level of support in exceptional ed, and so we pulled the plug on that one. Fortunately for those two individuals, they found other positions elsewhere in the district because they were valuable employees, and so we were excited about that. But it did just kind of remind us this is not an easy process. It is not an easy process, not for the faint at heart. We also were able to be more intentional about our title funds and our allocations because we knew the dollars were there always, but not always looking at the dollars. We were able to move some things around. We hired an additional instructional coach. And then we were able to also look at and eliminate some positions that weren't necessarily close to the students. Again, difficult decisions, but decisions that we think will pay off in the end. I'm really excited about where we're going with ERS. I think that their support has really helped my leadership team to look at how equity in our school is going to be different for different students. There's a lot of energy around this. I sent an email out to my teachers last week and said, hey, let's meet on Friday and talk about budget. I thought everybody would say no, we're out for a snow day. They all showed up. Everybody came. And so we spent about 3 hours really looking at, okay, what are the decisions that we need to make next year, and how do we begin to really align those key resources so that we can bring about the change that we need, and how we also align those key resources so that those resources fund our school improvement plan, really begin to address our staffing needs, and are clearly reflected in our budget. So we're excited about the process, and I'll be glad to answer any questions that you might have.
So we'll just open it up for questions.
But you guys have a seat.
We'll do it.
This is going to take a minute. I don't want you to get tired. Need more chairs?
Yeah, we'll grab it.
Chris, you'll need to use that handheld mic there.
Okay.
And just pass it around if you will.
We'll mix it up. Start on this end.
I guess the next question I'll have is, when is the budgeting done?
And based upon students moving from district to district, how are you able to identify those children who have special needs, those who speak English as a second language, and just how are you all able to determine what amounts of monies will be needed at the various schools based upon those things?
Yeah, I can answer that. So schools will actually are scheduled to receive their budgets on Thursday. I got some work to do tonight and tomorrow.
For next year?
But yeah, for next year. Yeah, so they'll start the budgeting process this week for next school year, based on projected enrollment for next year. So we have aggregate projections of how many students we think will be in the building, but we've also projected out the various components of the weights. So we are able to project of that total school projection, how many of those are going to be EL students, how many of those are going to be, or how many of those are likely to come to you as non-proficient students. What's the level of economical disadvantage in your building? Those sorts of things. So we do that. We'll do that this week. They'll have several weeks to develop their budgets. Then we'll go through a review and approval process. And then as we get more information, those budgets might adjust throughout the spring and summer. And then there'll be another adjustment that happens in the fall once the kids actually show up.
Okay, so my question is, do we have enough staff to monitor and serve as accountability pieces for all of these schools? What's going to prevent us from having 153 different school systems within a system?
Yeah. So I think I can answer that a couple of ways. So the initial, one thing we did was, as a kind of central leadership team working with schools, we developed a common and agreed upon set of, sort of a non-negotiable list of resources or things that schools had to invest in. Things like every school's got to have at least a guidance counselor and a librarian, some things like that are more resource-based. We also did some kind of non-staff position type things like, certain types of curriculum and things like that. So we leveled the playing field a little bit with that. And then everyone budgets on the same tool, which has a lot of kind of checks in it to make sure that people aren't doing things they can't do. So there's a lot of things that if they try to, make somebody an 8-month employee, right, they can't do it. Those sorts of things are, there's some checks that don't allow people to make those types of mistakes. Yeah, a 2-week employee. So we check things like that. And then principals also receive one-on-one support from their school improvement plan facilitator, which is managed out of the Office of Federal Programs. So over the next 3 weeks, they'll be working kind of hand-to-hand with both their school leadership team, but also their school improvement plan facilitator. That will help them complete the process in an effective way. And then it goes through a review process. And that review process involves people from the academic department, leadership and learning, from human capital, from finance, and from federal programs, reviewing the budgets at the same time, individually, school by school, and running those against the choices that they've made. Is that responsive or? Oh.
That helps.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, thank you for this presentation. We've got your expertise, and we've got 2 years of experience in the district now with school-based budgets. And I'm interested to know what those 2 years have taught us in terms of right here in Nashville. And has there been a tendency to hire teachers with less experience or fewer degrees, or has there been that tendency? And has there been any consideration, I suspect there has been, of bringing in staff, teachers to help in the decision process? It's not just an isolated principal decision.
Great question. I'm going to answer the technical question, and then I'll let Sheila answer actually how it looks on the ground in terms of how principals are, or how the staff at the school is engaged, and then what does it look like on the ground. So from a technical perspective, we're actually budgeting on average position costs, not actual position costs. So there's no incentive or disincentive to hire, more experienced versus less experienced staff. So that there are not misaligned incentives to do that in the system. So I just wanted to make sure that was addressed. But then I'll let Schuler kind of share the on-the-ground experience.
I would say, first response to that is that as a principal, I'm trying to hire the best teachers I can find, period. And I'm not going to look so much at, is this a new teacher that's cheaper or a more veteran teacher? In fact, we tend to look for teachers with a little more experience sometimes because we know that they tend to have a little bit better performance. Once we've hired a teacher, we might look to see, do we want to shift a teacher from local to title funding source, because that can affect some dollars saved, which is important. But in terms of that, we're going after the best teachers we can find. Some of the checks and controls with that, we do have our SIP facilitators who are fantastic at working with us on those nuts and bolts types of decisions. You can do this, you cannot do that. This is allowed through state regulations, this is not. But then we also have oversight with our executive lead principals on things more at the strategic level. This is in line with what most schools and best practices are. Maybe this is not. Tell me more about what your thought process is on why you want to make this decision. And so there's sort of a two-pronged approach to oversight there, both at that level on not making a decision on something that with auditors or spending is going to get you in trouble, but also with looking at, through leadership and learning, what is best practice, what is something, talk us through a decision, because sometimes there are things that are different and bold that people want to do, but there needs to be a good reasoning behind it, some research or something, some ideas that maybe this is something that someone's going to try.
Did you enroll teachers in that?
Oh, and absolutely. Part of our process with this was, we do a survey every spring. We start looking at what needs are, how we spent our money this past year, what teachers and people in our building thought was most effective. We come back and look at our data as well, and we say, our data tells us we need more attention here, more attention there. And our decisions at our school are made through a leadership team. And that way we have input from everybody at the different levels on how they should be spent.
Thank you.
I do. I have a couple of questions, actually. So we have some schools that have a really high mobility rate. I mean, double-digit mobility rate. The students that start the year don't finish the year. So how is that addressed as far as, obviously, and because they are high mobility, you may have just a complete change across as to what kind of student that is. So how is that addressed from the beginning of the year to the end of the year as far as?
Yeah, mobility was one of the characteristics that was on the short list of final things to weight that ended up not making the cut in the first year. We were focused on sort of keeping it simple out of the box and then adding complexity later. But mobility and homelessness, gifted and talented were things that we considered and went through the due diligence on.
Some correlations between that and some of the
Yeah, and ultimately why we chose not to weight some of them was because they were highly correlated with other factors that we were going to weight. And so it was in some ways redundant to weight those in some cases. The other component is, if you remember those schools that were in the top right corner that are already really high funded, many of those are your high mobility schools already. And so there was no combination of weights that would get those schools to that level of funding. So it just didn't end up, from a technical perspective, making a lot of sense. But it will be something, along with other factors, as we next fall, or this fall, I guess, as we think about the process and reflect on what's in the pool and what we're weighting, we will probably again go look at mobility and homelessness and gifted and talented and other types of resources and see where it shakes out.
Okay, and so to our two principals here, this appears to be a huge responsibility and very time-consuming. So tell me what your biggest takeaways or benefits are by using this model.
Well, for me, I would say the biggest thing is getting a budget that's customized to my school and my school's needs. And I know Damon mentioned some very specific things he did in his schools, and things we did in our school very specifically was we eliminated in-school suspension. We looked at our data. Our data showed that we were averaging fewer than 5 students per day in in-school suspension. Having a teacher allocated to that position was just not very effective. What we did need is credit recovery run every single period of the day, every day. And so we shifted that resource over to there. It's been very effective for us. We've been recapturing students who might not have been on time to graduate, get them back on track. And so when we see results like that come out of it, that's what's most effective. We've been able to put more resources into hiring teachers to do co-teaching, some innovative models, both for exceptional education and for ELL students. And those were positions that would not have been there through our staffing formula in previous years. We've gone from one of the lowest schools in the district for co-teaching and inclusion to one of the highest schools in a matter of about 3 years doing that. And so being able to see those results, those kind of results are what help kind of drive us to say, yes, this is working, it's something we benefit from.
And just really continuing, I mean, that's kind of the same answer. We've seen an opportunity to really align our key resources with our needs. And because our needs are different, really looking at what does our data tell us. And this is our first year, but already as we look at next year, I think we're being even more intentional about where those dollars should be spent so that we can address those areas where our students are not achieving. It involves a lot of time, you're correct, but it also involves a lot of people. The leadership team is a really key component of this. They communicate with teachers on their grade level team or content team, and so they also bring ideas about instructional strategies that they need additional support in, or communication, or the need for technology. So it's a big process, but there are a lot of people that are help making decisions that are more focused on what our needs are.
Thank you.
And just one other quick follow-up. It is a lot of time, but the difference is this time spent being proactive rather than being reactive.
Ms. Kim?
I first of all just thank you for doing the work, the whole team, all of it. It's just, Sometimes it's hard to keep a project going for a month, much less 3 years. And so there's tons of discipline and careful thought and evolution that is so clearly evident in this. So thank you. I'm just encouraged substantively by it, philosophically, like symbolically, all this. I mean, because it feels to me that this work really does, like, again, symbolically and substantively put you, Schuler, and you, Damon, at the top, like, positions you exactly as you are, which is like CEOs of your building. You know, for you to have that flexibility to make those changes that you were describing and that you were describing, Damon, seems really critical to attract the kind of talent that we want in the building, who, you know, folks who really, like, love having the ability to make shifts based on, you know, what the needs of their students are. So I just love that. And it seems like some of the most, like, intensely student-centric work that I've seen come up in a while. I mean, just your examples right there say it, everything. It's just every school is different. We can't know across 157 schools from Bransford exactly how everything should be run. And so the fact that you all are just running with that and deciding what to do for your kids, I just think it's fantastic. I have a couple questions. But one is more, one is around just the link of this work to accountability. So it was referenced in one of the slides. I would love just to hear your various, maybe more the district view. And then the second one was more, if you could, and this I think this is a bigger, I think a district-wide question, sort of, I don't know, articulate, I guess, the 17-18 plan and the 18-19 plan. What would that look like? The next phase. Is there even a next phase? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, if we, yeah.
I'll take a crack at this first, and Chris, you can add anything if you want. I mean, I think in terms of the link to accountability, again, the goal of this work is not to develop school-based budgets, and not, I mean, it's not developing a budget and a master schedule and a staffing plan, right? The goal is personalization, individual school designs, and so the expectation is principals that really own the work and really feel empowered by it, I think will make the changes that are needed. And some of those may be massive changes, some of them may be minor changes depending on the school in order to boost student achievement. And so, I mean, I think you'll see those results, manifest themselves in, the academic performance framework and other tools. Now, if the school doesn't improve, it may not have anything to do with student-based budgeting. It may be because the principal didn't have the capacity to do the work, or there are other confounding factors. But I think this is intended to support the personalization at schools, which, according to our theory of action in the strategic plan, is ultimately about driving personalized designs. And I can say there isn't an 18-19 plan or a 19-20 plan at this point in time. I mean, Denver's been at this for about 8 years, and they just every year the design just looks a little bit different. So they add weights, they take weights away, they increase the size of the pool, they decrease the size of the pool. There's all kinds of different factors that play in over time. So it'll be just an iterative process. This feels a bit like a big bang, but it's just a first time out of the gate. But next year we'll be able to come back with, okay, we need to adjust this weight or that weight, or increase this one, decrease that one, and it'll just be iterative from that perspective.
This is based on what asking that. I mean, how would they know what needs to be adjusted?
Dr. Gentry, how would you know how to make the pivots, I guess, make the adjustments?
So, and I guess I'm sorry to hog your time, but so if we don't have, to your point, right, I'm not doing this because I think this lever is going to move or this number is going to change on the academic performance framework. But I am doing it because I believe it's the right thing to do, and I don't think anyone at this table would disagree with that. So when you say you're going to tweak some of the weights, what are you looking for to determine what needs to be tweaked?
I'll start with kind of what we did in the first year, and then actually I think Jonathan's probably best placed to answer this, having seen it across multiple systems and across multiple years in terms of the what's the work we should be doing, because that's some of where we're at now. So where we started from is actually looking at predictors of academic performance. So we ran, we did sort of like engaged Paul Changus, did some multivariate regression to figure out which of these individual factors, if isolated, had a correlation or causality to or predictive nature
to achievement. And so we looked at, status as an EL learner, status as a free and reduced lunch student, status as a non-proficient student 3 years prior. So we looked at all of those things, and which ones were the strongest correlations is ultimately where we ended up. And so my thinking on what we'll do is we'll continue to do that type of work. And as those things become, because they had different impacts, right? Being an EL student had a different predictive power than being a student who's economically disadvantaged. Now, we've weighted them the same at the elementary level, but we may go back and look at the data and realize, actually, we think that we need to provide more resources for ELL than, for having an EL status than just being an economically disadvantaged student. So I think it's that type of work. But Jonathan, you could probably add a little more context.
So there will be some set of really truly tweaks that are entirely technical in nature that come just as a consequence of changing the average projected teacher cost, for example, or changing the size of the overall SBB pool so that the weights sort of keep track. You sort of keep your weights on pace with inflation, if you will. Purely technical. There's another, and I think probably the more interesting part of this is the continuous improvement part. So you will be able to see in just a couple of months here the choices that schools made. You'll be able to survey principals, understand their experience, do some focus groups, what worked well, what didn't work well, what flexibilities actually did you not have this year that would have been helpful given what you got. So you'll get a whole nother round of stuff that you're going to want to explore for this next cycle, and you'll work on that over the summer and fall to incorporate. You may come out of this thinking, you know what, this timeline needs to get pushed back by X number of days or weeks, whatever it may be. I think one example of continuous improvement that we worked on with the folks in Denver, and I would say, frankly, that if you want to go out and talk to other folks, Denver's probably furthest ahead of the districts that we are aware of that are doing this kind of work. They, for a number of years, weighted English language learners at a certain level. We worked with them to do some analysis to help them and they understood that schools that had higher concentrations of English language learners were actually investing more in that student group and less in the non-ELL group in that school than what the weights were providing. That led them to say, okay, well, actually our market is speaking to us, and we're hearing from that market that it makes sense to increase the ELL weight to better match the behavior that we're actually seeing to better match the market, the behavior that we're seeing on the ground. So lots of examples of sort of listening, analysis to help drive what then the next priorities for change are in the subsequent year.
You have a question?
Likewise, would like to echo the appreciation that's been expressed around the table for doing the work. Really excited about the idea of driving more equity and resources toward our EL population. I've had the opportunity a bunch of times to visit Overton recently, and alum of Overton, go Bobcats, and what has happened there has, over the last couple of decades in particular, has been extraordinary and created some really profound challenges and opportunities. And I think coming at this from a perspective of resource allocation is really important and overdue. So I got a couple of key questions. First is, can you just kind of recap where we are kind of on the implementation continuum? I mean, piloting started when, design work is now substantially complete, and when does it scale system-wide? Sure.
So we began implementing the work 2 years ago in this time 2 years ago in preparation for SY 13-14. And in school year 13-14, there were 15 schools 17 schools that started, ended up being 15, that were, effectively what we did was we monetized their budgets. So they earned a set number of teachers and librarians and counselors, and we just calculated the cost of all those and said, here's $3.5 million. Here's a list of things you can spend it on. Make a budget. That was the first kind of go around, and some of those principals did some intentional design work and went through the process. We then reviewed the output of that work in the after those principals did their budgets and started the year and decided, this was around the time that Education 2018 was being written, and it very much aligned with that theory of action. And so it was at that point in time that we decided to scale it out. And we wanted an intentional growth plan. So middle schools and high schools made the best sense from just a numbers perspective to scale it out to, as well as many of the principals and many of the high school principals had already been through a redesign process through the academies of Nashville. So they were sort of a prime audience to sort of continue with the flexibility. And for this upcoming school year, for 15-16, we are scaling the flexibility component district-wide to 139 schools, so 121 sort of zone neighborhood schools plus the 18 non-traditional alternative special education centers. And of those 139, 121 of those, just the zoned kind of neighborhood traditional magnets, will receive resources through the formula. The rest of them will continue to get the allocation, a monetized allocation of positions, but they will have the ability to have input into how those positions are utilized.
Okay, so total scale by when? Full scale?
Full scale by, like now. So
okay.
Yeah, for next school year, we'll be full scale.
Okay.
For next school year.
So the elephant in the room is, I guess, how these dollars are moved, if not between schools, then programmed out of new resources. So if I heard you correctly earlier, what you were saying is we're not going to rob Peter to pay Paul, but we are going to create an environment, I assume, where as new revenue becomes available, then those schools who are in need of more resources are going to receive more of that newer revenue than perhaps other schools who don't. Is that an accurate way to describe it?
I would say yes, and we addressed this fairly bluntly and head on in terms of how we wanted to approach it, in terms of not cannibalizing other schools to support schools that needed equity gains. Chris is probably in the best place to provide the details, so let me just pass this one down here.
Yes, we made a conscious decision to not harm any of our current schools that were receiving additional resources that showed up on that graph up in the top right corner. We wanted this to be a positive thing. We didn't want just the fact that we were transitioning to student-based budgeting to harm or to hurt any school. And so obviously if you've got the hold harmless provision in place, yet you're looking to make equity gains at other schools, high-need schools, ELL schools, that's going to require additional resources. And so it's a combination of either requesting additional resources or looking at areas where reductions can be made. And so we are looking at that in both ways. And we'll be, as we bring forth our budget proposal to the board, we will include that, of course, in our budget proposal, budget request. So there will be a need for either requested increase in budget, or there will be a need to make reductions in other areas so that we can provide those equity gains to the schools that need it and deserve it.
I just have one other comment. I would encourage you all, and I know you're thinking about it already, as this gets refined, to make sure there's just a lot of transparency and visibility around it, and that it's easy as much as it can be to explain to parents and the public. I think, if we're not careful, we could kind of end up going down the same path that the state has gone down with the basic education program formulas, and basically it's kind of this black box that nobody understands. But if we are kind of going more toward this formulaic approach, just being like super thoughtful about how we communicate and broadcast the decisions that are being made. Thank you.
Ms. Pierce?
Thanks. I would have loved to have that transparency now. So I don't think I've ever really figured out how the indirect dollars are dispersed across the district, but that's secondary. It sounds like this whole thing, sounds wonderful, but it does really raise the bar of a principal and who that person is and their ability to plan strategically and really own their building and do the design. So what supports, I know Derek, you touched on this with the executive team, but just to really hire well and then also encourage those principals to design and develop and then execute, even programmatically in their buildings. Is there flexibility for that, or is this first wave is mainly just budgeting and staffing?
thought of that. Primarily, I think when people think about student-based budgeting, they actually think about completing the budget and who the staff is in their building. I think it's worth pointing out, though, that there's a lot of things that you can do in your building that maybe wouldn't impact the staff in your building. Right? I mean, you could be investing in 10 different professional trainings throughout the year, when really it's just 5 of those that you really need to focus on and go deep on. So there's a lot of things you can do, I think, within a budget that's not going to impact people. But I'm probably not the best person to speak to how principals are being hired against that. I mean, maybe Jay could speak to it. But to your point about kind of raising the bar on principal, maybe, I don't know, Damon or Schuler can talk to if they feel like this has challenged them in any ways that have forced them to, get stronger or better in certain areas, maybe.
I think I start off by saying that I don't think that this idea of empowering principals has come out of left field just this year. This is something that really for the past 5 years that Dr. Steele and Dr. Register have been promoting, the idea that we're going to give you flexibility and hold you accountable. And so it has started with smaller steps, and this is just the next step in a sequence of actions they've taken to do that. And so that's part of it. And successful principals have been able to build a network of people within their own building, their own leadership team, our mentors and supervisors through leadership and learning, where we can go to, we can bounce off ideas. I know when we start looking at master schedule and hiring and spending dollars, I sit down with the ELL office. That's one of the first ones I go to because of the population in our school. We'll spend a lot of time with special education office, talking with them about thoughts and ideas and things that we can do. So that type of collegiality is a big part of that. And of course, we all sit down with each other and we talk about ideas and things that we've done in our school that work for us. And sometimes you look at it and you think, that's neat, but I don't know if I can pull that off in my school, or I don't know if I necessarily need that in my school. But sometimes you look at one and you think, I want to find out more about how that's working for you, because I think that's an idea that could work for us.
I think this process too, because we know that, as an administrator, part of our evaluation is an understanding of how we work with our budgets to really allocate funds so that we're addressing those needs. I think that this process is welcomed because I think most principals appreciate accountability when that accountability also includes funding and decision making that can impact what you're doing in the school. We want our schools to be places where students are being successful. Being able to make decisions around our student needs then holds us to a higher level of accountability. We have to measure that, assess that, correct changes, correct mistakes and make changes in order to be successful. And I think we welcome that. As Schuler said, we look to resources that are available in the district, but we also partner with colleagues across the state or in other states so that we understand what some of the best practices are out there about this type of funding and just making sure that we're developing plans for our schools that are positive.
Just one more thing to add to that. Having this linked to the school improvement plan process is part of what makes it highly transparent, and make sure that you have members of your team involved with it and that you're using it for steps and decisions that you need to do to improve your school. So that's a big part of that as well.
Well, I'm thrilled with this. I think it's a wonderful plan, and it's clearly been thoughtfully designed, and I think it's much needed. I'm primarily excited about it because of the increased focus and equity, because obviously we know we have a very disparate population at MNPS, and there are obviously some children that are more costly to educate, and so I'm hoping that this will make a real impact on getting resources to the schools that most need them. And also, I think it's been sort of clear to me that principals and teachers and schools have all the accountability and little to no autonomy. So I'm excited that you all are going to be able to have a little more control. I think most of my questions have been addressed, but I thought it was interesting that you mentioned we will not be able to really link academic outcomes directly to the school-based budgeting, which makes perfect sense to me because we know there are a myriad of factors that play into school success. And then you mentioned, I guess my question is, how are we planning to measure the success of this program? You mentioned principal satisfaction, but are there other ways that we hope to measure success?
Jonathan, I'll let you add anything else to this, but much of it's captured, I think, in the measures of success section. There's some, there's some components of that measurement that are, do we continue to be committed to it as a district in terms of providing a meaningful level of flexibility to principals, and we'll continue to ask principals, are you taking advantage of your flexibility? Are you aligning your resources to your needs? Do you like it? Do you like participating in it? Are you glad you have this flexibility? Do you want us to take the flexibility away? Those types of things, because I think principals loving it is an important measure of success, and also continues to focus us on making sure that we continue to identify more and more resources to provide the control over and find that right equilibrium. I don't know, beyond that, are there other things that we can measure?
That's right. If you're familiar with Tony Brick's work on implementation, you can sort of measure how much are you actually implementing the thing that you were intending to, and then what are the outputs, not necessarily the outcomes, but the outputs of that. And so I think what we want to measure here looks at both of those. You mentioned a number of, so I think the thing that I would add would be, how are we designing our schools differently than we were previously? A bunch of that is going to be qualitative and case study-ish. Are there individual schools that we see that, I think we heard two very interesting stories here about sort of an increasing alignment between design and need. But let's unpack those a little bit and understand if there's commonalities across. Are we investing in teacher effectiveness in ways that are now different than we were previously as a system, or as sort of in our entirety of schools? Are we differentiating based on need differently collectively than we were before? You can actually get into metrics on the sort of the exact designs that schools are employing.
Can I ask one more? I'm sorry, we get to.
Try to take a stab at that. That's the question we ask ourselves every time when we make a decision about spending money or implementing a program in our school, is how will we know if that's successful or not? And so we start looking at what type of metrics do we have. And sometimes we have some nice hard metrics like end-of-course exams and graduation rates. Sometimes you have peripheral measures like attendance rates and discipline gaps and things like that. But then sometimes you're also getting into things that are more culturally based, like your TEL survey, your STEP survey data, teacher retention rates, teacher attendance rates, things like that. So there's a lot of data we can look at to determine are we implementing this the way we want. Ultimately, the bottom line is achievement. That's what we're really after. But sometimes you have some other measures that will come first, like the culture of a building will improve, your attendance will improve, you'll close some gaps first, and then some other things follow.
One last thing, and I think Mary's already touched on this and some others have too, but just I think the oversight, that's the biggest concern that I hear, whether all of our principals are really ready for this next year. And so I'm happy to hear that you already have a lot of oversight in place sort of at the beginning of the process, but I was wondering what kind of oversight will happen during the year, whether there are computer programs that are going to address some of this, and what would happen if things just went horribly awry.
Give me an example of what you mean by middle, during the year.
Well, you were saying at the beginning of the year that they have to enter their budgets into this program that will direct. I mean, is that monitored by the computer program during the year, or do we have staffing that will oversee what's happening within the school? Like, what if a principal just completely misuses funding, and do we?
Got it. Yeah, I mean, those are checks that are already being put in place by Chris and his team in terms of school audits and things like that. But so schools will complete a budget tool that will aggregate across the whole district. Will provide visibility to finance and transportation, finance and human capital. All the different moves where people are at, and that budget will continue to be active throughout the year. If a position becomes vacant. And needs to be refilled, needs to be filled with another person. The mechanism is there to check whether we've got position control in place, and then there are just general accounting things around, spending of spending of student supply money and things like that, which are already in place. Chris can probably talk more about that, but I don't know if you really want to get into the minutia of that at this point in time, but we can.
So I just have one other question. One other question. So Chris, Mr. Henson, how is this different from the oversight that you have previously been accountable for all the schools? Is it going to be, just give me a clear picture of
It's very similar. It's just different. With the budget tool, it does have the checks so that just as in prior years with position control at a district-wide level, a principal was not and will not be able to hire more people than the principal has budget. That would be the case this year, last year, the year before, and the year before, and next year. Because the same types of checks and balances are in place to be sure that's not going to happen. It's just a different way of looking at it. The design of the budget tool is such that it continues with the same concept that we've had all along on a district-wide basis, captured down to the individual school level.
Okay, so going back to how SVB works in practice and the amounts that are allotted for each individual area, is the amount that's allotted for special ed 2,125? Is that across the board?
No, there are varying options based upon.
Yeah, because I see here it says option 2.
Yeah, that's one example. There are varying number of options based upon student need, based upon level of disability, based upon number of hours served. And so if you go back to the model, it shows that for an exceptional ed student, the low range on the option could be an additional 0.5, but the high, which would be an additional 50%. But on the high end could be over 800%. So it varies based upon the IEP of the student and the level of disability and the number of hours required to serve.
Good, thanks.
Okay. So I have, I think, two questions. For Ms. Froeg's last question, I would assume we have a budget cycle, right? And so at some point in time, the budget cycle is closed. And so there is no opportunity for a principal then to go back in and say, I changed my mind, I want to move dollars someplace else or use dollars that are in this line item for something else, right? So there's a budget cycle that's been communicated, the principals understand what their timeline is, and so then that budget is locked.
Not necessarily.
Oh, well, okay then.
Obviously, when you hire people and when you have tenure law, you're going to be committed to hiring those individuals for a year unless you go through the process of documentation and discipline, et cetera. If there is a vacancy in a position, we have allowed schools to look at, okay, this money is now freed up. Is there something that you might want to look at differently with this money that's left, rather than hiring the same type position that you budgeted for at the beginning of the year? And then there are some other sort of discretionary funding areas where, based upon changes that might occur from when the principal puts his or her budget together in early spring, when we get to mid-year of the next year, things might have changed, needs might have changed, et cetera. So we do allow some level of change. It's not necessarily locked, but it's pretty close, just because the majority of the school's budget is going to be made up of people. And so when you commit to hiring someone for that school year, usually they're going to stay in place, and usually the school and the principal wants to continue with that same type position. Did you want to say something else?
There are a couple of opportunities to reallocate funds during the school year, and I've done this a few times already. I had a teacher that left in the fall. We made a decision not to replace her, to absorb that into our master schedule and use those funds in other areas.
Is that a process that's...
We work through our SIP facilitator for that. And there's certain times you're allowed to do that, and it's under a lot of control and oversight.
Okay, very good. So my next question is really on the human resources piece. So your example was very interesting. Right? So you had two, I guess, two positions, or maybe it was you, I don't remember, and you decided you wanted to trade those two in for one of a different skill set. My question is really probably more for human resources and I think this goes to a question that came over here, are we really prepared for that potential churn? So are we prepared to absorb those now currently unallocated resources and skill sets back into the pool? How is that pool or that availability communicated out to other schools and other principals, and the capacity? And so my question becomes, we've been talking about a national recruitment strategy. We've got the 100 thing. So there's another now piece here for human resources to sort of absorb and be prepared to be responsive. And I would suggest highly responsive to, especially given this additional piece of information of mid-year or, school year changes in resources. So I don't know if there's someone from HR to speak to that.
I think I could effectively address this question because in this case, HR is not being responsive. HR is being massively proactive and has been a partner in driving the work for the past couple of years. So, and really gone through some growing pains with us as we scale up and have been really on the forefront of helping us make the process better from a human capital perspective. So, so I would say that they've been lockstep. So it's been a perfect synergy of finance and human capital and academics in terms of making this thing work. I will address your question directly, but in following up from your first question about dates and cycles and things like that, the one date that's relevant to this human capital question is we have set and established and said 100 times, what there's a drop dead date after which you cannot make any changes to your budget that would negatively impact a person in your building. We don't think it's fair that somebody finds out they lost their job on the last day of the school year or on June 30th. So we've set a date and we've said you can continue to tweak your budget, you can trade out positions and do some things like that. But after a certain point in time, in early May, no more changes that negatively impact people in your building. Now, if you have a vacancy that pops up and you choose to do something else with that, no one's hurt by that negatively. But so we do have that in place. And in terms of our experience, I think last year's probably the only data that we have to go on. Last year we did have several support positions that were sort of not continued with. I think we had about 18 of those, and I think the vast majority, maybe short of a couple, were able to find employment in the district, either in that school, in another school, or in another role. And so there is some potential churn as a result of it, but we think we'll be able to minimize that by being proactive about continuing to identify positions that schools don't want and helping to think through, is there another role in your building for that person, and maintaining kind of a list on the back end so we can proactively send it out to schools to say, hey, if you have a vacancy for this type of position, like here's a list of people that you might want to go look at, so we can minimize any of the human impact of it. Because as Dr. Kathy said, right, there's people that exist on the other side of that budget for the most part, and we want to make sure that we treat people well too.
Well, we anticipated that this would be long, and I do apologize for the next topic, and I don't know how much you want to say on it, but I do want to just say, I know even when we first started, I was over here whispering to Elise, I was like, this sounds like a Jedi mind trick, right? Someone give you all this access and this ability to do these things, and then the more you think about it, that this is where the rest of America is, right? The rest of the world, this is how we function. We look at what it is we're trying to accomplish, then we look at what it is we believe we need to get there, and then we resource ourselves and to better position ourselves for success. So, it all makes perfect sense. And I've used these quotes a couple of times before, right? And I reiterate with much pride that they both came from two females. And one of them says, if you want to see change, you want to do something different, you have to create pain. And we knew that this was going to be a painful exercise that we went through, that we've gone through, and that pain has already been created as we look at the scores of our students across the district, and we know that we need to do something different to change what we're seeing in that space. And the other quote is, I must control those things that directly impact my success. And no one can argue that being able to resource appropriately for what it is you're asking me to do from an academic performance perspective, from a student achievement perspective, from a teacher and principal satisfaction perspective, there's no greater driver than that, than the budget and being able to resource appropriately. So again, want to echo the thanks that has already been given from this table, and thank all of you for what you've done in this space, and I definitely look forward to big bang, full throttle to see where we go from here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
May I ask one question?
No, you can ask a question. Oh, okay, sure.
Yeah, so Jonathan, I appreciate your work and the work of all the group here, and this has been a long-standing work in progress. I would ask you one question for a short answer. Sure. Where does this put us in relationship to other school systems across this country in terms of flexible funding, student-based funding?
Well, there's a very small set of districts across the country that are offering school leaders meaningful flexibility, above that 1% to 5% that I was saying at the beginning. Within that, it'll be really interesting to see as the ink dries. I think, given that you've already done, that you've got 55 schools already in, you've got the next batch here, I think you're going to start out high. But it'll be interesting to see how it goes.
Good. Thank you very much.
Do you want to say anything about that audit, or just briefly mention?
We have also on the agenda is a performance of a discussion of the performance audit. I made some general comments at the last board meeting, and of course we're well past our time for the work session at this point in time. I will say that next week on March 2nd at 4 o'clock, we have a joint meeting with the Board of Education and Metro Council Budget and Finance and Education Committees. And so I would recommend that we defer further conversation until next week. Three o'clock.
Dr. Gentry, can I ask that we consider breaking up discussions about the performance audit and tackling it in the committee system? So it's, out of a 617-page document, it's just kind of too much to deal with in one sitting. But there are, for example, a lot of observations and recommendations relative to communications and community engagement that could be dealt with in Community Engagement Committee, or there are a lot of recommendations in the educational service delivery section that might be dealt with in teaching and learning, or, I think the whole section on charter fiscal impact, acknowledgement that it is significant, and there are significant short-term costs that need to be addressed. Seems like something we ought to try to tackle in a separate conversation. So I just want to lob in that request and see if we can deal with it in bite-sized pieces over time.
Well, I think there'll still be a general overview, high-level presentation, so that no one's out of the loop about what has already been shared with, that's going to be shared with the council, or has been shared at that council joint meeting. But we do, whatever the outcomes and the action items that need to happen, I think the committee system is the appropriate place to come back and bring recommendations if there's something that happens, at the, definitely with policy level or board level, that we can affect. All right. Wrap this one up. Can I only hit the gavel like one time, and it's like an end to this and a start to the board meeting? Right, I can do that. Okay, good, very good. So we do have a quorum. Amy, come on, let's lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, because all this again. I can't see that far to know who's out there. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. All right. I want to make one change to the agenda before we go forward, and that's to remove item 3 under governance issues. And I don't think I need, yeah. Number 3 under actions. 1 is consent, 2 is disciplinary, 3. Yeah. I thought you said something else. I'm sorry. I heard CD something. Yes. Do we have to vote on that? I had to make a motion in a second.
Second.
Any opposition to removing that? No. All right. I know y'all want, I know y'all miss it. I know y'all want to talk about it. I was so nervous. Okay. Nothing under awards and look, it goes straight to you. Consent.
A, recommended approval of change order number 1 for Antioch Middle School renovations, R.G. Anderson Company Incorporated. B, recommended approval of change order number 3 for Granbury Elementary School additions, Orion Building Corporation. C, recommended approval of change order number 3 for Jolton Middle School additions and renovations, Southland Constructors, LLC. D, recommended approval of change order number 8 for Rose Park Middle School renovations, Messer Construction Company. E, recommended approval of request number 24 for district-wide maintenance, repairs, and general construction, Health Science Simulation Lab at Hillwood High School, Southland Constructors, LLC. F, awarding of purchases and contracts. 1, Amplify Education. 2, Catapult Learning, LLC. 3, CDW Government, LLC. 3 summaries. 4, Education Resource Strategies, Incorporated. 5, McGrath Training Systems. 6, Metropolitan Transit Authority. 7, National Center on Time and Learning. 8, Puckett Engineering, PLCC. 9, TBD awardee for RFP 1510, E-rate. 10, The Big Picture Company. 11, Vanderbilt University Center for Science Outreach. 12, World Strides. G, Textbook Adoptions, Math K through 12. H, New Course Proposal, Acting 1 at McGavick High School.
Can I motion to approve?
Madam Chair, I move that we accept the consent agenda as read.
Is there a second? All in favor? Whoa.
Discussion.
Oh, okay, yes.
So I rarely get excited about the consent agenda, but I'm excited about this one. There's one item on there that I'd really like to learn more about as the work progresses, which is item number F7, National Center on Time and Learning. For anybody who's not familiar with this organization, it is the leading nonprofit organization in the country that really is doing the most cutting-edge work about rethinking the school calendar, how it's been organized over the last century, how it needs to be, we need to rethink it. And I think, this group really promotes the idea that, more consequential than the number of days on the calendar spent in school is the amount of time spent learning. And I think it's, as we have learned from this week's inclement weather, our greatest resource is, in fact, time, and I think the more we can spend talking about it, the better for the students. So I don't know. I know that this particular contract is related primarily to priority schools, Dr. Register, but are there opportunities we can kind of hear more about that work as it proceeds?
We'll be glad to bring that for discussion at the next meeting.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thanks for putting it there.
I don't even know how that works. So Ms. Kim needs to make a correction to the consent agenda. So we'll have to redo the motion with the correction. Go ahead.
All right, just a change in number 9. The vendor is Insight Public Sector Incorporated.
Okay.
And not TBD awardee for RFP 1510 E-rate. I thought that was a little odd.
TBD.
Madam Chair, I move that we approve the amending consent agenda.
Second.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Any further discussion? All right. All in favor? Yeah, we did that. Okay, we're good.
Can I just ask one quick question back? The National Center on Time and Learning, is that a new relationship? Or
No, it is not. As a matter of fact, we've been working with them for 2 years, I understand.
Okay.
So. Item number 2.
Madam Chair, I'll ask Board Attorney Corey Harkey to come forward and speak to the student disciplinary appeal.
Yeah, my understanding is that you have all been provided with the packet that accompanied this disciplinary appeal from the beginning. The parent of the child has just requested going through the 3 levels of appeal that are provided by MNPS pursuant to state law. The parent has requested that this come before the board as a level 3. The way that this works, and I sent you the law beforehand, but you the Board of Education, based upon a review of the record, may grant or deny a request for a board hearing and may affirm or overturn decision of the hearing authority with or without a hearing before the board. So what's before you is really a request for a hearing, which you can approve, and that hearing would be set on a different agenda at a different time, more than likely closed to the public pursuant to statute. Or if you, after review of the file, if you're wanting to go ahead and overturn or approve the decision that's already been made without a hearing, you have the authority to do that. I'll certainly take questions. I know this is one of the first times that we've had a discipline come to you, so if you have any questions, I'm more than willing to answer them.
I just want to restate, we have two options tonight. One is to grant a hearing or not.
Mm-hmm.
Two is to just overturn or uphold.
Correct. You can affirm or overturn the decision without a hearing. Because this is a confidential student file, we don't normally have open discussion
Right, I
about
understand that part.
employment records, or I'm sorry, student records. That's often why the easiest thing to do is to kind of look at this as, do you want to have a hearing? And if you do want to have a hearing, set it off so that you can get more details and have the hearing to review this. Or since you've already had the board packet, if you are ready to make a decision, you can do that tonight.
So I should just ask for a motion and a board
Yes.
member will state one or two preferences?
Yes.
Okay.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
I would move that we affirm the decision by the, whomever made the last decision. I can't remember.
From the level 2 appeal?
The level 2 appeal, correct.
Is there a second?
Second.
There's been a motion to uphold the decision that came from the second level of the appeal process, and it's been seconded. Is there any discussion? All right, we're ready for the vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? All right, we decided to uphold the decision of the second.
Without a hearing.
Without a hearing.
Thank you.
All right. Oh, that was painless. Wow. Committee reports. Ms. Shep.
That's me. All right, I'm giving the class report Coalition Water School Systems. Due to the inclement weather last week, both the class winter meeting scheduled for Monday, February 16th and TSBA Day on the Hill activities were canceled. The class winter meeting is potentially going to be rescheduled for a later date. However, TSBA Day on the Hill will not be rescheduled. House Bill number 0159, filed by Representative Quesada, that states that the state of Tennessee cannot distribute federal funds it receives on behalf of local government if the state did not apply for these funds on behalf of all local governments, will be heard in subcommittee on Wednesday, February 25th at 1:30 in the House Local Government Subcommittee, and I would urge my colleagues to, and viewing audience, to contact your legislators and urge them not to pass this bill out of subcommittee. It would hurt primarily MNPS schools and Shelby County schools because we asked for and applied for and received funds for our pre-K program, which I think is we all think is a very important part of our schooling in Metro Nashville Public Schools, and of course Shelby County does too. So this would mean that we wouldn't be able to accept those funds, and I personally think that's unacceptable since we applied for these funds because we know how important that is for our students. Also on Wednesday, the State Education Committee will hear Senate Bill number 89, which would allow the ASD to be able to recruit non-ASD students into ASD schools. This could cloud some test results by recruiting better students into the ASD schools. It would increase the ASD budgets as well. Interesting to note that the Shelby County has a petition by parents to get their students out of ASD schools. And last Wednesday, the entire class membership was invited to be part of a conference call around potential litigation that the Knox and Hamilton County school boards have voted to pursue around the inadequacy of the BEP funding. BEP funding has never been at full funding that it was intended to be, so those two school systems have taken that step to do that. I think Shelby County was voting tonight on that. Madam Chair, that concludes my report.
Thank you very much. And then we'll go to announcements.
Yes, thank you. I love the passion that I see at Stratford High School. Mike Steele had the pleasure of announcing 12 full scholarships for Belmont University to seniors at Stratford High School. Congratulations to the entire faculty, parents, and students who will be recipients. Much appreciation to Bridges to Belmont Scholarship Fund. Dr. Sue Kessler, would you just wave your hand so that we can recognize you? Dr. Kessler testified in front of a congressional hearing in Washington, D.C. over the last, 2 weeks ago? And Sue was the Outstanding Educator honoree in 2011 for ASCD. And she responded to 2 questions with the congressional delegates. What is your school doing to implement innovative approaches to improve academic outcomes for students, especially low-income students? And how can we, as a district and the federal government, improve NCLB, No Child Left Behind, to encourage more states, districts, and schools to innovate? Congratulations, Sue. 2 weeks ago, we celebrated that Jack Alshauer received an Emmy Award for producing the YouTube video for Maplewood High School. The YouTube video chronicles the school, the neighborhood. Maplewood saw 5 principals in 5 years. Is that right, Dr. Register? Was it 5? So. 5 principals in 5 years prior to Dr. Woodard's arrival. He didn't convert when he came in. He wasn't able to convert 1 grade at a time. He took the established student body, the building as it was, the community that was entrenched in problems with poverty, and through real innovation, he changed the climate of the school. He inspired excellent teaching. He inspired student changes in behavior, and he turned the school around. Dr. Woodard and I and several members of the staff will present at the National School Board Association conference next month. Our next Teaching and Learning Committee meeting will be tomorrow, February 23rd at 11:30, and Dr. Ron Woodard will be there to talk to us about student success. Thank you.
Anything else, Michelle? Thank you. Okay, I have a couple. The Budget and Finance Committee, which is a committee of the whole, will begin their budget talks around the operational budget on Tuesday, March the 10th at 3:30 in the boardroom, and again on Tuesday, March 24th, again at 3:30 in the board conference room. If extra meetings are necessary, we will schedule those on Tuesday, March 31st and Tuesday, April the 7th. We will vote on our operations budget on Tuesday, April 14th, first in committee and then on the board floor. It is likely that we will have to go and present our budget to the council the same week that we vote on the budget on the board floor because of a timing issue. And as Dr. Register said, on Monday, March the 2nd, the Metro Council Budget and Finance and Education Committees will hold a joint meeting with the Board of Education members. That meeting is scheduled to happen at 3 p.m. in council chambers. Thank you.
Ms. Kim? Mr. Kingston?
Not an announcement, just a request for a future conversation. I'd love for us to have created an environment where we can have a discussion about differentiated school openings following inclement weather. This week has been the 2nd time since I've been on the board that icing in a few outlying parts of the county essentially caused a shutdown in areas that were basically in the clear. And parents, as we know, in some areas of the city are upset today and yesterday. I know it's a logistical challenge, and I don't want to understate the gravity of the school closing calls that were made this week. I understand why, and I think it was the right thing to do at this time. But in a county with 526 square miles, I think we might want to start recognizing that clusters, might need to be able to operate a little bit more independently. So if we can move to school and student-based budgeting, then maybe we can do the same way with scheduling around inclement weather events. I'd just like to discuss that at some point in the future. Thanks.
Ms. Peters? Ms. Rowe? What'd you say?
I said I agree with Mr. Pinks.
No.
I was just going to say a couple things. First of all, I wanted to echo Ms. Spearing's comments about Dr. Kessler and her excellent and very brave testimony in Washington. And also, I wanted to thank Fred Carr and Tony Majors and our excellent staff for responding to a need during these past snow days when we found out unexpectedly that a lot of children who receive free lunch and breakfast now might not have food during the snow days, and they set up several food distribution locations to meet the needs of our students, which is so important. And so it's really excellent work, and also it highlighted a need that we as a city need to address so that we're not responding only in emergency situations. But great work.
Okay, well, very good. I have actually 3 things to say. Ooh. Yeah. First is going back to to close the loop on our search committee meeting that happened prior to the work session. We had this meeting, it was a search committee, which is a committee of the whole. We met immediately prior to the work session. We voted unanimously to recommend hiring Hazard, Young, and Atia. We're asking for your help, Mr. Henson, on the next steps in procuring the contract, which then is the item that we will vote on. So giving notice now that that item will be up for a vote at the next meeting, so we can move forward on that. The second thing is there will be a meeting of the audit committee. I just want to clarify the times. I think we had a little confusion over here. So the audit committee meeting, the joint meeting with the council, is actually scheduled for March the 12th at 5 o'clock. And then I got a very nice surprise in my mailbox, and I actually got it a few weeks ago. It was a packet of thank you notes from the students at Ross Elementary. As you know, it was converted to one of our pre-K centers, so I will definitely bring that in for you all and have it in the boardroom, and we'll read a few of them as a part of our good news section at the next meeting. And Ms. Crowe?
There being no further business, this meeting is adjourned.
You guys rock.